This story doesn't begin with flashing lights or shouting headlines. It begins with a question that feels uncomfortable the moment you hear it. What if the person everyone was worried about was exactly who they should have been worried about? Sit with that for a second. Because for months, depending on who you ask, people whispered it online, hinted at it in comment sections, argued about it in late-night podcasts, and quietly thought it without ever saying it out loud. And then, suddenly, it wasn't a theory anymore. It was a plea. 3 words in a courtroom. No theatrics. No dramatic speech. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Just an admission that landed like a dropped glass in a silent room. And in that moment, a family story that once lived behind gated walls and carefully managed public images cracked wide open for the world to stare into. This is the story of Rob Reiner, a man whose voice, films, and opinions helped shape American culture for decades. A man known for humor, conviction, and moral clarity. A man whose life, from the outside, looked structured, successful, even predictable. But this story isn't about movies. It's about what happens when the private life no one sees collides with the public life everyone thinks they know. Because on a quiet Sunday, December 14th, everything stopped. Inside a $13.5 million estate in Brentwood, 2 lives ended. Michelle Reiner, 70 years old. Rob Reiner, 78. The official language would later say multiple sharp force injuries. The manner, homicide. Cold words. Clinical words. Words that don't begin to explain what it feels like when a family realizes it will never be the same again. And here's where the story takes its first sharp turn. Their son, Nick Reiner, 32 years old, lived on the property. Not in the main house. In the guest house. Close enough to hear things. Far enough to feel separate. Think about that setup for a moment. Living steps away from your parents, yet not under the same roof. Included, but not fully. Present, but somehow peripheral. Comfortable on paper, complicated in reality. And then the timeline tightened. Police arrived. The property locked down. Questions started flying faster than answers. And before the night was over, Nick Reiner was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. That alone would be enough to shatter any family. But what came next is what made people stop scrolling. Because the first person to raise alarms wasn't a neighbor. It wasn't a security guard. It wasn't an outsider with a grudge. It was their daughter. Reports say Romy Reiner, 27, was the one who discovered the bodies. And more chilling than that, she allegedly told police something that echoed across headlines like a low rumble of thunder. She warned them about a dangerous family member. Someone who, in her words, should be a suspect. Pause right there. Ask yourself honestly, what does it take for someone to say that about their own sibling? This wasn't a comment made in hindsight. It wasn't a theory formed after social media speculation. It was an immediate warning. Which raises a question that still hasn't stopped haunting people who follow this case. If she was afraid then, was she afraid before? Because fear doesn't usually arrive out of nowhere. It builds, quietly, over time, in moments no one sees and arguments no one hears. Yet in the days that followed, something strange happened. Public opinion split cleanly down the middle. On one side were those who saw a tragic but straightforward narrative. A horrific crime, a suspect in custody, justice moving forward. On the other were people who hesitated. People who said, something about this doesn't add up. Was it mental health? Was it family conflict? Was it resentment that had been simmering for years? Or was the truth simpler and darker than anyone wanted to admit? Then came the silence. Nick didn't speak publicly. The family retreated. Lawyers did the talking. Weeks passed. Then months. Speculation filled the vacuum. Online theories multiplied. Comment sections became courtrooms. Everyone had a take, and everyone was sure they were right. But certainty is easy when you don't have to live with the consequences. Behind closed doors, something else was happening. Pressure was building. The weight of accusation, grief, and isolation pressed harder every day. And then, when many assumed the story would drag on for years in procedural limbo, it ended with a sentence no one expected to hear so soon. He pleaded guilty. No dramatic denial. No defiant claim of innocence. No last-minute twist. Just an admission that confirmed what some people said they had suspected all along, and shocked others who never believed it would go that far. So let's slow this down. Because a guilty plea doesn't just end a legal process. It opens emotional floodgates. Why plead now? Why not fight? Why not explain? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all. If this was inevitable, were there signs everyone missed? This is where the story stops being about crime and starts being about family. Because families don't implode overnight. They fracture along fault lines that exist long before the breaking point. Small resentments, long silences, conversations that never quite happen, roles that feel fixed and unfair. The guest house becomes more than a living arrangement. It becomes a symbol. Close, but not equal. Present, but not central. Supported, but maybe not understood. And while the public sees wealth, privilege, and opportunity, the private reality may look very different from the inside. Ask yourself this. How often do we assume that proximity equals connection? Living near someone doesn't mean you feel seen by them. Being provided for doesn't mean you feel valued. And being part of a famous family doesn't guarantee belonging. None of this excuses what happened. None of it explains it away. But it does complicate the story in ways that matter. Because if the fear Romy allegedly expressed didn't come out of nowhere, then there were chapters of this story written long before December 14th. Chapters no police report can capture. Chapters that don't fit neatly into charges or plea agreements. And that's why this case refuses to settle quietly in people's minds. It's not just about what happened that night. It's about what happened before. The conversations that ended abruptly. The arguments that never fully resolved. The moments where someone might have thought, this isn't normal, and then pushed the thought aside. So when the guilty plea finally came, it didn't feel like closure. It felt like confirmation. Confirmation for some, devastation for others. And for the rest of us, a disturbing reminder that even families we think we understand can hide realities we never see coming. But here's the part no one talks about enough. A plea doesn't tell us everything. It doesn't explain the emotional timeline. It doesn't answer why certain warnings were made. It doesn't reveal what dynamics existed behind the scenes. And it certainly doesn't tell us how close this family may have come to a breaking point long before that Sunday ever arrived. Because the truth is, the moment Romy allegedly warned police, the story shifted. That wasn't a reaction. That was recognition. Recognition of something already known. And once you accept that possibility, everything else looks different. The guest house, the silence, the timing, all of it starts to form a pattern. But what was that pattern? And how long had it been there? Because the next chapter of this story doesn't begin with the crime. It begins years earlier, inside a family that the public thought it understood. And once you see that part clearly, the guilty plea stops being the most shocking moment of all. It becomes the inevitable one. But if the guilty plea felt inevitable, the real question becomes this. What kind of family produces inevitability? Because stories like this don't begin with violence. They begin with patterns. Patterns that look harmless at first. Patterns that outsiders dismiss as normal family stuff. Patterns that, over time, harden into something dangerous. So before December 14th, before the police tape, before the plea, you have to understand the family everyone thought they knew. This chapter starts there, with the Reiners as America saw them, and the Reiners as they actually were. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When a family is famous, the public fills in the blanks for them. We assume stability. We assume communication. We assume love looks clean and organized. But what if that assumption is the first lie? Because from the outside, this family looked almost boring in its success. A powerful father with a long, respected career. A mother known as steady, grounding, deeply involved. Children raised in privilege, opportunity, and proximity to influence. The kind of family people point to and say, if anyone has it figured out, it's them. But let me ask you something. How often do the families that have it all actually talk about what's wrong? Success has a way of silencing discomfort. Money cushions tension. Fame rewrites conflict as inconvenience. And in families like this, problems don't explode. They compress. Rob Reiner's public identity was built on strong opinions and clear moral stances. He spoke. He challenged. He took positions. And for decades, that voice carried weight. But inside a family, a strong voice can feel very different than it does on a stage or screen. Inside a family, it can dominate. That doesn't make someone evil. It doesn't make them abusive. But it does shape the emotional climate. In households where one presence is especially large, others adapt. Some become peacemakers. Some become quiet. Some disappear emotionally long before they ever leave physically. And some never leave at all. This is where the story of proximity starts to matter. Because the Reiner property wasn't just a home. It was a system. Main house, guest house, defined spaces, defined roles. And Nick, the son, existed in a strange middle ground. Not a child anymore. Not fully independent either. Close enough to be watched. Far enough to be separate. Think about how that feels. You wake up every morning within walking distance of your parents' lives, but not inside them. You're present for family events, but not central to them. You're supported, but maybe not consulted. Included, but possibly not trusted. That kind of arrangement can be practical, or it can be psychological purgatory, because independence isn't just about money or housing. It's about autonomy. It's about being seen as an adult with agency. And when that recognition doesn't come, resentment doesn't announce itself. It whispers. People close to families like this often describe a particular tension, a politeness that feels too careful, conversations that avoid landmines, emotions that are managed instead of expressed. Everything looks calm, until it isn't. And here's the contradiction no one likes to talk about. Fame amplifies family pressure, but it also isolates family members from outside correction. Who tells a powerful father he's wrong? Who challenges the narrative when the narrative works? Who says, this dynamic isn't healthy, when the results look successful? Most people don't. They adjust instead. They swallow frustration. They joke it away. They convince themselves this is just how families are. And when you grow up inside that, your sense of normal gets warped. You start to believe discomfort is just part of love. That silence is peace. That distance is respect. Until one day, it isn't enough anymore. This is where the idea of inevitability begins to form. Not as destiny, as momentum. Because long before police reports, there are emotional reports no one files. Moments when someone feels unheard. Moments when someone feels sidelined. Moments when someone thinks, they don't actually see me. And those moments stack. Now let's talk about Romy. Because her alleged warning to police didn't come from nowhere. People don't describe family members as dangerous lightly. That word carries weight. It implies fear, not annoyance. Concern, not disagreement. Which raises an unsettling possibility. That there were prior moments that made that word feel appropriate. Arguments that crossed lines. Behavior that felt unpredictable. Emotions that didn't regulate the way they should. And here's where the story gets uncomfortable for the audience. Because if there were warning signs, why didn't anyone stop this? That question haunts every family tragedy. The answer is rarely simple. Families normalize what outsiders would question. They protect reputations. They avoid public embarrassment. And when fame is involved, the stakes feel even higher. No one wants to be the person who overreacted. No one wants to fracture the family image. No one wants to believe the worst about someone they love. So they wait. They hope things settle down. They tell themselves tomorrow will be better. They trust that love is enough to hold things together. But love without intervention can become denial. And denial is quiet. From the outside, this family still looked intact. Holidays happened. Appearances were made. Life continued. But inside, something may have been drifting out of alignment. Nick's position in the family system mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Being physically close but emotionally distant can magnify feelings of exclusion. Every interaction becomes a reminder of what you're not. Every boundary feels personal. Every perceived slight cuts deeper because escape is limited. And here's a question worth sitting with. What happens when someone feels like they belong nowhere? Not fully independent, not fully embraced, not fully heard. That emotional limbo is dangerous territory. It doesn't automatically lead to violence, but it can lead to instability, to fixation, to spiraling narratives inside someone's head. Especially if those narratives aren't challenged early. And this is where families often miscalculate. They assume time will fix it. They assume maturity will arrive on its own. They assume silence equals calm. But silence can also mean pressure building in isolation. By the time December arrived, the family wasn't just navigating normal tension. They were navigating accumulated weight. And weight doesn't disappear. It shifts, sometimes suddenly. So when people say, "I never saw this coming," what they often mean is, "I didn't know where to look." Because hindsight has a way of illuminating moments that felt insignificant at the time. The guest house doesn't look like a footnote anymore. It looks like a boundary, a separation that symbolized something deeper. And Romy's alleged warning doesn't look reactive anymore. It looks informed, which forces us to confront a harder truth. That the family may have been living with fear longer than anyone realized. Not constant fear, not dramatic fear, but low-level, background fear. The kind that makes you choose your words carefully. The kind that makes you monitor moods. The kind that makes you feel relief when distance exists. And if that's true, then December 14th wasn't a rupture. It was a release. That's a terrifying thought, because it means the tragedy didn't arrive unannounced. It arrived after being ignored. And now, with a guilty plea on record, people are desperate to find meaning in the past, to point to the moment that should have changed everything. But families rarely get one clear moment. They get dozens of small ones. Moments they dismiss. Moments they rationalize. Moments they promise to address later. Until later never comes. So as we move forward in this story, keep this in mind. This isn't about demonizing one person or sanctifying another. It's about understanding how systems fail quietly. Because what happened next, the arrest, the plea, the headlines, didn't start in a courtroom. It started years earlier, inside a family structure that looked stable from the outside and fractured from within. And once you understand that, the next chapter becomes impossible to ignore. Because the next part of this story isn't about who was arrested. It's about the son who never really left. And what happens when proximity becomes a cage. What happens when staying close doesn't mean staying connected. Because this chapter isn't about absence. It's about presence. The kind of presence that weighs on you every morning when you wake up and realize you're still here, and nothing has changed. This is the part of the story people misunderstand the most. They hear guest house and imagine freedom, independence, a soft landing between childhood and adulthood. But proximity without belonging doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like being watched from the edge of the room. Nick didn't leave. That detail keeps coming back for a reason. He didn't disappear into another city. He didn't build a life far away. He didn't cut ties and start over. He stayed. And staying can mean many things. Sometimes it means loyalty. Sometimes it means dependence. Sometimes it means unfinished business that refuses to let go. Think about how rare that is in families with wealth and options. Most adult children drift outward. Distance creates relief. Space smooths conflict. But Nick remained within walking distance of the center of power in his life. Every day. And when you stay that close, every interaction becomes amplified. A glance feels like judgment. A boundary feels like rejection. A silence feels deliberate. The guest house wasn't just where he slept. It was a psychological border. Not inside the family nucleus. Not fully outside it either. And that in-between space is where tension grows best. Because here's the contradiction. From the outside, living on the property looks like privilege. It looks like support. It looks like generosity. But from the inside, it can feel like a reminder that you haven't moved forward. Ask yourself honestly, how would it feel to live steps away from your parents' main house as an adult? Would it feel comforting? Or would it feel like being frozen in time? Every family has a hierarchy, even when no one admits it. And in this family, the hierarchy was clear. The main house wasn't just bigger. It represented authority, decision-making, final say. The guest house represented something else entirely. Conditional independence. You're on your own, but not really. You're grown, but still supervised by proximity. You're free, but only within invisible boundaries. That kind of arrangement can work when communication is strong. But when communication weakens, it becomes a pressure cooker. Because distance is what lets tension dissipate. Without distance, tension circulates. People who've lived in similar situations describe a constant low hum of awareness. You're always aware of who's home. Who's watching? Who might hear something? Who might comment later? It's not surveillance in the literal sense. It's emotional surveillance. And emotional surveillance changes how people behave. They suppress. They perform. They internalize. Now add family expectations into that mix. Expectations about responsibility. Expectations about behavior. Expectations about gratitude. Because when support is visible, gratitude is often assumed. But gratitude doesn't erase resentment. In fact, sometimes it deepens it. Because resentment thrives when someone feels they owe everything and control nothing. This is where people often get uncomfortable. They want clear villains and clear victims. But family systems don't work. And when someone struggles to be seen, they compensate, they withdraw, they escalate, they fixate, or they do nothing at all and let frustration ferment quietly. This is where hindsight becomes dangerous, because after a tragedy, people retroactively assign meaning to every detail. The guest house becomes symbolic. The proximity becomes ominous. The silence becomes suspicious. But before December, those same details were easy to overlook. That's how normalization works. You get used to arrangements that would alarm outsiders. You tell yourself this is just how things are. And families are especially good at this. They don't see warning signs as warnings. They see them as quirks, phases, temporary rough patches. So let's talk about emotional distance. Physical distance is easy to measure. Emotional distance is not. You can sit across a table from someone every day and still feel miles away. In fact, that kind of closeness can make emotional distance hurt more. Because you can see what you're not part of. You can hear laughter you're not included in, decisions you weren't consulted on, plans you learn about after they're made. That chips away at identity. And when identity erodes, people start filling in the gaps with stories. Stories about why they're excluded. Stories about what others think of them. Stories about injustice. These stories don't need to be true to feel real. They just need to be unchallenged. And that's where isolation becomes dangerous. Because isolation doesn't always look like being alone. Sometimes it looks like being close but disconnected. Now think back to Romy's alleged warning. Dangerous. That word implies unpredictability, volatility, something that makes others adjust their behavior around you. If there were moments of emotional instability, they didn't emerge overnight. They would have shown themselves in flashes. Arguments that escalated too quickly. Reactions that felt disproportionate. Moods that shifted without warning. Families often respond to this by walking on eggshells. They soften language. They avoid confrontation. They create distance where they can. And sometimes, they use physical structures to manage emotional risk. Separate living spaces. Defined boundaries. Unspoken rules. Those strategies can maintain peace. But they don't heal anything. They just delay reckoning. And here's the part that's hardest to confront. Sometimes, the person in the guest house knows exactly how isolated they are. They feel it every day. They watch life move forward without them. They sense that they're being managed rather than engaged. And that realization can be corrosive, because being managed feels dehumanizing. It turns relationships into logistics. And when someone starts to believe they are a problem to be contained, not a person to be understood, something breaks internally. Again, none of this excuses violence. But it explains why inevitability begins to feel possible. Because inevitability doesn't come from one event. It comes from accumulation, from unresolved conflict, from avoided conversations, from arrangements that prioritize calm over honesty. By the time December arrived, the guest house wasn't neutral. It was charged, a symbol of everything that hadn't been said. And when pressure builds in silence, it doesn't release gently. It bursts, which brings us to the moment everything shifted. The day the family's internal dynamics collided with the outside world. The day police arrived not as visitors, but as witnesses. The day proximity stopped being a coping strategy and became a liability. Because what happened next didn't just expose a crime. It exposed a family's fault lines to the world. And once that exposure began, there was no controlling the narrative anymore. The next chapter doesn't start with speculation. It starts with sirens. And the first words spoken that night would change how this story would be told forever. The sirens didn't announce themselves as tragedy. They announced themselves as interruption. Because in the early moments, before tape went up and names hit the news, no one inside that property knew how this night would be remembered. There was no headline yet, no narrative, just urgency, confusion, and a sense that something was deeply wrong. This is the chapter where the private world collapsed into the public one. The chapter where speculation ends and consequences begin. And it starts with a moment that still feels unreal when you slow it down. Someone enters a space expecting normalcy. A door opens. A step forward. A second that doesn't make sense. Then everything changes. What people often forget is that discoveries don't feel cinematic when they happen. There's no soundtrack, no clean realization. Just shock, disbelief, and the instinctive hope that what you're seeing isn't real. Reports say Romy was the one who found them. Think about that. One moment you were a daughter. The next, You are a witness. There is no training for that transition. No preparation for the sound your own voice makes when panic takes over. No script for what to say when the people who raised you are suddenly gone. And yet, in the middle of that chaos, she allegedly said something that would define everything that followed. She didn't just call for help. She pointed. According to reports, she warned police about a dangerous family member, someone she believed should be a suspect. That detail is easy to gloss over, but it shouldn't be. Because in moments of shock, people revert to instinct. They don't calculate. They don't strategize. They react. Which means whatever fear or concern led to that statement existed before that door ever opened. This wasn't hindsight. This was recognition. Now imagine the position that put law enforcement in. They weren't walking into a random crime scene. They weren't dealing with strangers. They were stepping into a family implosion. Every question they asked would cut into fresh grief. Every step they took would be watched by people who were suddenly both victims and potential witnesses. And within hours, the focus narrowed. Nick was there. He lived on the property. He had proximity. He had access. In criminal investigations, proximity is never neutral. It doesn't prove guilt, but it demands attention. And that attention came fast. By the end of that night, Nick was arrested. No prolonged standoff. No chase. No disappearance. Just a quiet, devastating shift from family member to suspect. From son to accused. And this is where public perception begins to distort reality. Because from the outside, arrests look decisive. They feel like resolution. From the inside, they feel like freefall. Imagine being taken away while your parents' bodies are still in the house. Imagine knowing that your last moments in that space are being reframed as evidence. Whether you believe in guilt or innocence, that moment is psychologically seismic. It fractures identity, and fractures don't heal cleanly. As dawn approached, the property transformed. Lights, tape, unmarked cars. Neighbors woke up to a street that didn't look like it had the night before. By morning, the story had escaped containment. Names leaked. Details trickled out. Speculation ignited. But there was something missing. No one had heard from Nick. No statements. No explanation. No denial. Silence filled the space where answers usually go. And silence is dangerous in high-profile cases. Because when silence appears, people fill it. They filled it with assumptions about motive. With narratives about family tension. With amateur psychology. They dissected photos. They reread old interviews. They tried to retroactively decode the past. But inside the system, something else was happening. Charges were filed. 2 counts of first-degree murder. That's not language chosen lightly. First degree implies intent, planning, premeditation, and that alone reshaped the conversation. This wasn't being framed as a moment of loss of control. It was being framed as something deliberate. The weight of that distinction cannot be overstated, because intent changes everything. It changes how the public sees you. It changes how the legal system treats you. It changes how your family remembers you. And yet, even as the charges were announced, there were gaps. Key details were withheld. Timelines remained vague. Authorities released only what they had to, which meant uncertainty lingered. People asked the same questions again and again. Why? How? When? And perhaps the most painful question of all, was there a chance this could have been stopped? The official cause of death would later be described in cold terms. Multiple sharp force injuries. Homicide. Language designed to document, not to grieve. But grief doesn't respond to documentation. It responds to meaning. And meaning was in short supply. As the days passed, a strange tension emerged. The case seemed straightforward on paper, but emotionally, it felt unfinished. People sensed that this wasn't just about a crime. It was about a family that had been holding something together for too long. Because if Romy had enough concern to issue a warning, then there were chapters missing from the public story. Chapters about fear, about conflict, about behavior that didn't sit right. And those chapters didn't appear in police reports. They lived in memory, inside private conversations, inside half-finished arguments, inside decisions that seemed minor at the time. And now, those memories were being re-examined through the harshest possible lens. Every interaction became suspect. Every disagreement was revisited. Every boundary was questioned. That's what tragedy does. It rewrites the past. Inside the justice system, momentum carried forward. Court dates were scheduled. Defense strategies discussed. Prosecutors prepared narratives. But still, Nick didn't speak. No interviews. No statements. No attempt to shape public perception. That silence became its own story. Some saw it as guilt. Others saw it as shock. Others still saw it as legal strategy. But no one could ignore it. Because silence, like proximity, is never neutral. And here's where the timeline tightens again. Because months later, when people expected a drawn-out battle, something unexpected happened. A plea, not a deal whispered through back channels. A formal admission. And that admission retroactively changed how people viewed that first night. Suddenly, Romy's warning felt prophetic. The arrest felt inevitable. The silence felt deliberate. But hindsight is seductive. It smooths chaos into narrative. The truth is, that night was not orderly. It was fractured. A family splintered in real time. And once the system took over, there was no putting the pieces back the way they were. The sirens didn't just announce a crime. They announced the end of a family as it had existed. And the beginning of a story that would never stop asking why. Because the next chapter doesn't focus on what happened that night. It focuses on what happened after. The months of silence. The pressure that built behind closed doors. And the moment when that pressure finally broke in public. Because when Nick finally spoke, he didn't just answer charges. He rewrote the story. And what he said would force everyone to reconsider what they thought they understood. What makes someone break ranks inside their own family? That's the question people keep circling, whether they admit it or not. Because speaking up against a sibling isn't just an accusation. It's a rupture. One that echoes forward and backward at the same time. It's about the moment a sister crossed an invisible line, and why that line may have already been worn thin long before police ever arrived. To understand that, you have to strip away the headlines and sit inside the psychology of fear. Not panic, not hysteria. Fear that has been learned. Fear that has been tested. Fear that has become familiar enough to feel normal. Reports say that when officers arrived, Romy Reiner didn't just describe what she found. She allegedly issued a warning. She didn't ask a question. She didn't speculate. She identified a risk. Dangerous. That word deserves attention. People don't use it casually when talking about family. Especially not in the first moments after trauma. Especially not when the consequences of saying it are irreversible. Because once you name a family member as dangerous, you can't take it back. So what leads someone there? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Fear inside families doesn't usually announce itself with dramatic incidents. It builds through repetition, through patterns that feel wrong but don't feel actionable, through moments that make you uneasy but don't quite justify confrontation. It's the argument that escalates too fast, the reaction that feels disproportionate, the sense that someone's emotional state can flip without warning. At first, people explain it away. They're stressed. They're struggling. They didn't mean it. Families are especially good at rewriting red flags as empathy. They protect. They excuse. They minimize. Until the cost of minimizing becomes too high. Ask yourself this. If you felt uneasy around someone you loved, how long would you wait before saying something? A week? A year? Never? Most people choose never. Not because they don't care, but because they do. Because confronting fear inside a family feels like betrayal. And betrayal feels worse than discomfort. At least until the moment discomfort turns into something else. This is where Romy's position matters. She wasn't an outsider. She wasn't a distant relative. She was close enough to see the dynamics clearly and far enough to recognize when they were unhealthy. And sometimes, that perspective is the most dangerous one of all. Because it puts you in a bind. If you say nothing, you live with the fear. If you say something, you fracture the family. There's no clean option, which makes her alleged warning even more telling. Because it suggests that in that moment, fear outweighed loyalty. And fear only outweighs loyalty when it has already crossed a threshold. Think about the timing. This wasn't a statement made weeks later, after reflection or influence. It was immediate, instinctive. That suggests preparedness. Not planning. Preparedness. The kind that comes from having already imagined this scenario, even if you never wanted it to happen. And that's chilling, because it implies that the possibility had been considered before. Not as certainty, as concern. Now imagine what it's like to live with that concern. To share holidays. To attend family events. To sit across tables and pretend everything is fine. That kind of emotional labor is exhausting. And it changes how people behave. They become watchful. They become cautious. They choose their words carefully. They may even create physical or emotional distance where possible. Which brings us back to the structure of the household. Separate living spaces don't just manage logistics. They manage risk. They reduce contact. They create buffers. They provide relief. But buffers are not solutions. They only work as long as nothing disrupts them. And when something does, everything collapses at once. Romy's alleged warning also forces us to confront another uncomfortable idea, that there may have been attempts, quiet ones, to manage a situation that felt increasingly unstable. Families often believe they can handle things internally, that involving outsiders would escalate rather than help, especially in families where public image matters, because asking for help feels like failure, and acknowledging danger feels like accusation. So they wait. They hope maturity will settle things. They assume time will soften edges. They trust that love will hold. But love without boundaries is fragile, and boundaries without enforcement are symbolic at best. By the time police arrived that night, whatever strategies existed had already failed, which means the warning wasn't just about that moment. It was about everything that came before it. Now consider the cost of that warning. From that second on, Romy's role in the family was altered forever. No matter what happens legally, emotionally, there is no return to normal after something like that. She didn't just lose her parents. She lost the possibility of a unified family narrative. And that's a grief people rarely talk about. The grief of knowing that no version of events will ever fully reconcile everyone. Because even if the legal process ends, the emotional questions remain. Did she wait too long? Did she misread something? Did she do the right thing? Those questions don't have answers that bring peace. They just replay. And the public's response didn't help. People judged her immediately. Some praised her courage. Others questioned her motives. Some accused her of betrayal. All without knowing the private history that led to that moment. That's the cruelty of public tragedy. It flattens complex human decisions into sound bites. It demands certainty where none exists. And it ignores the fact that fear is not a moral failure. It's information. Information that someone chose to act on when the stakes were impossibly high. But here's where the story twists again. Because as the case moved forward, Romy didn't keep speaking. She didn't go on tours. She didn't give interviews. She didn't attempt to control the narrative. She retreated. And retreat is telling. It suggests that the warning was not about attention. It was about safety. And safety doesn't need applause. It needs action. Inside the legal process, that initial statement carried weight. It shaped early assumptions. It influenced investigative focus. It framed how events were interpreted. But outside the system, it did something else. It changed how people looked back. Suddenly, moments that once seemed ordinary felt ominous. Suddenly, the guest house wasn't just a living arrangement. It was a boundary. Suddenly, silence wasn't just privacy. It was containment. And suddenly, the guilty plea, months later, felt less shocking to those who had listened closely from the start. Because in their minds, the warning had already told the story. Not in detail, in tone, in instinct. But instinct isn't proof. And that's what makes this chapter so difficult. Because you can understand why someone spoke up without claiming they knew the outcome. You can validate fear without celebrating tragedy. You can recognize warning signs without believing everything was predetermined. And yet, the warning still hangs over this case like a shadow. A moment that can't be undone. A sentence that can't be unheard. Because it asks a question that refuses to go away. If fear was present before that night, how long had the family been living with it? And what happened in the months after the arrest suggests that fear didn't end with the warning. It transformed. It became silence. It became waiting. It became pressure. And that pressure would eventually find its release in a courtroom. But not yet. Because before the plea, there was something else. Something quieter. Something more isolating. A long stretch of time where one person sat alone with the weight of accusation, grief, and consequence. And what happens to someone in that space is where this story turns again. What happens when the noise fades and you're left alone with the truth? Because after the arrest, after the headlines, after the initial shock burned itself into the public imagination, something else took over. Waiting. It's suffocating. It's about the months no one watched closely enough. The stretch of time. Did they always see me this way? Were they afraid of me before? Is that what I've been reduced to? Those questions don't bring clarity. They bring erosion. And erosion doesn't happen loudly. It happens in private, when no one is watching. This is the phase where legal realities begin to sink in. First-degree murder isn't just a charge. It's a narrative. It implies intention. It implies forethought. It implies a version of events that leaves little room for misunderstanding. And once that narrative is established, pushing against it requires extraordinary resources: emotional, financial, psychological. For someone already isolated, that weight can feel insurmountable. Here's something people rarely consider. Legal battles aren't just fought in courtrooms. They're fought inside people's heads long before verdicts are reached. Every day becomes a calculation. If I fight this, what does that look like? Years of hearings? Public scrutiny? Family testimony? And at what cost? Because the cost isn't abstract. It's time. It's energy. It's the slow dismantling of whatever remains of your inner world. This is where the idea of pleading guilty begins to form, not as a decision, but as a possibility. Not yet as action, as escape. Escape from uncertainty. Escape from waiting. Escape from the version of yourself that exists only as a suspect. That doesn't mean guilt has been accepted. It means exhaustion has set in. And exhaustion makes people do things they once swore they never would. Now consider the family dynamic during this period. There was no unified front, no joint statements, no public expressions of reconciliation. Everyone retreated into their own silence. Grief fragmented, and fragmented grief doesn't heal, it isolates. Each person mourns alone. Each person processes fear privately. Each person carries their own version of what happened. That kind of fragmentation makes communication almost impossible, because every conversation risks reopening wounds, and every silence reinforces distance. This is where inevitability tightens its grip, because when communication breaks down completely, decisions stop being collaborative. They become solitary. Nick was making choices alone, not in a supportive family environment, not in open dialogue, but inside a system that had already labeled him. And systems don't offer empathy. They offer options. Bad options. Worse options. But still options. Fight and risk everything. Or admit and end the uncertainty. That's the brutal simplicity of it. People often say, why didn't he just tell his side of the story? But telling your side requires believing someone wants to hear it. And by this point, the world had already decided what it wanted to believe. The narrative had momentum. The warning. The proximity. The arrest. Each piece stacked neatly. There was no appetite for nuance. Only resolution. And resolution, in the legal sense, often comes through admission. So when the plea finally arrived, it didn't feel impulsive. It felt heavy, like the end of a long internal argument. But before we get to that moment, there's one more layer to understand. The psychological toll of being perceived as dangerous. That label doesn't just affect how others see you. It infects how you see yourself. You begin to question your own memories, your own reactions, your own intentions. Was I always like this? Did they fear me for a reason? Is this who I am now? That kind of self-interrogation can be destabilizing, and destabilization narrows choices. It makes extreme decisions feel reasonable, because when you no longer recognize yourself, preserving the future stops feeling urgent. Ending the present becomes the priority. This is why the plea shocked some people and made sense to others. Because from the outside, it looked sudden. From the inside, it was the result of months of psychological compression, pressure without release, isolation without reassurance, waiting without hope. And when the plea was finally entered, it did more than end a legal chapter. It reframed everything that came before it. The arrest no longer looked provisional. The warning no longer looked cautious. The silence no longer looked ambiguous. It all snapped into alignment. But alignment doesn't equal understanding. And that's where the story refuses to rest. Because a guilty plea answers one question and raises 10 more. Why now? Why not earlier? Why not later? What broke first? The will to fight, or the belief that fighting mattered? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, was this plea an admission of guilt or an admission of defeat? That distinction matters, because it changes how we understand responsibility, remorse, and truth. And the next chapter forces us to confront that distinction head-on. Because the moment those words were spoken in court, the room didn't feel resolved. It felt heavier, as if something else had just begun. And what happened in that courtroom would ripple outward, into the family, into public memory, and into how this story would be told forever. Because a plea isn't the end. It's a turning point. And the next turn is where everything shifts again. The room didn't erupt when the plea was entered. There was no gasp, no shouting, no cinematic collapse. Just a stillness so heavy it felt like the air had thickened. This chapter begins in that silence. Because silence after a confession isn't relief. It's shock settling into place. Nick stood there as the words were spoken, words that can't be softened no matter how carefully they're delivered. A guilty plea doesn't just communicate acceptance. It finalizes identity. In that moment, he stopped being the accused. He became the one who admitted. And that distinction matters more than people realize. Because admission doesn't only speak to the court. It speaks to the family, to the public, to history. The judge followed procedure. The attorneys did what they always do. But beneath the formal language, something raw was unfolding. This wasn't closure. It was collapse. Ask yourself this. How does a family hear those words and still breathe? Because for Romy, the plea didn't confirm suspicion. It confirmed loss. Loss of parents. Loss of a brother as she once knew him. Loss of any version of the future where this story ended differently. And for those watching, the plea did something else. It forced a reckoning. People who had defended Nick felt betrayed by reality. People who had suspected him felt vindicated and uncomfortable about it. Because vindication doesn't feel good when it's paid for with blood. This is where the emotional contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. You can accept the plea and still feel unsettled. You can believe the legal outcome and still feel like something essential is missing. Because a guilty plea tells us what someone is willing to admit, not necessarily everything that happened. It simplifies a narrative that, emotionally, remains complex. Inside the courtroom, the focus was narrow. Charges, counts, consequences. Outside, the focus exploded. Social media erupted again, this time with certainty replacing speculation. Headlines hardened, language sharpened. No more allegedly, no more suspected. The story locked into place. And that's dangerous. Because once a story locks, curiosity dies. People stop asking why. They stop examining context. They stop looking for meaning. They assume the answer has arrived. But answers without understanding don't bring peace. They bring stagnation. Inside the family, the plea functioned like an emotional earthquake. Fault lines that had already cracked finally split. There was no more room for ambiguity. No space for denial. Everyone had to choose how they would live with this truth. Some chose silence. Some chose distance. Some chose to disappear entirely from the public eye. And in that silence, something else became clear. The plea didn't unify the family. It finalized fragmentation. Because even though the legal question was answered, the emotional ones remained unresolved. What were the warning signs? Who noticed them? Who ignored them? Who tried to help, and how? Those questions don't disappear with a guilty plea. They become heavier. Because now, asking them feels like reopening a wound people are desperate to close. And yet, without asking them, the story risks repeating itself somewhere else. This is where the public narrative begins to diverge from the private one. Publicly, the story is neat. Crime, arrest, plea. Privately, it's anything but. Privately, people are replaying moments. A conversation that felt off. A reaction that lingered in memory. A feeling that was dismissed because it was inconvenient. And those replays are relentless. Because hindsight has no mercy. Now consider Nick's internal world at the moment of the plea. People assume relief follows confession. Sometimes it does. But often, it doesn't. Often, it brings a different kind of weight. The weight of finality. No more imagining alternative outcomes. No more hoping for misinterpretation. No more waiting. Just the knowledge that this is now the story forever. That realization can be crushing. Because when the future collapses, the past becomes louder. Memories sharpen. Regrets amplify. Meaning becomes obsessive. And in that state, people don't just feel remorse. They feel exposure. Every part of their life feels subject to interpretation. Every decision feels re-examined through the worst possible lens. That's not absolution. That's psychological freefall. Which brings us to an uncomfortable pause. If the plea didn't bring peace, what did it bring? It brought certainty. And certainty is a double-edged sword. It ends debate, but it also ends inquiry. And this story deserves inquiry. Not to excuse, not to sensationalize, but to understand how a family arrived here. Because understanding is the only thing that offers prevention, and prevention is the only meaning tragedy can ever offer. As sentencing loomed, attention shifted again. What would the punishment be? What would justice look like? Those questions matter, but they're not the most important ones. The most important question is this: how many moments did this family pass through where a different choice could have changed the outcome? Because tragedies like this aren't single failures. They're accumulations. And the plea, as definitive as it is legally, doesn't erase the chain of events that led to it. It simply marks the point where the chain can no longer be denied. As the courtroom emptied and the story settled into its final public form, something else happened quietly. The past stopped being theoretical. It became permanent. And permanence changes how people grieve. Because now, grief isn't just about loss. It's about responsibility. Who saw what? Who said something? Who stayed silent? Those questions don't fade. They haunt. And in the next chapter, we're forced to confront them head-on. Because once the legal story is settled, the emotional investigation begins. And that investigation leads somewhere uncomfortable. Back to the moments everyone overlooked. Back to the dynamics everyone normalized. Back to the signs that felt too small to matter, until they mattered more than anything. Because the most disturbing part of this story isn't the plea. It's what it reveals about how close this family came to stopping everything, and didn't. 3 words. That's all it took. Not shouted, not dramatized, not delivered with a speech. 3 words that landed in the courtroom and then echoed outward, changing how every moment before them would be remembered. I plead guilty. People talk about those words as if they are an ending. They're not. They're a beginning. Because what follows a plea isn't relief. It's reckoning. This chapter begins in the seconds after those words were spoken, when no one quite knew how to react. When the legal machinery continued to move, but the human beings inside the room froze. Think about that moment. You've waited months for clarity. You've prepared yourself for multiple outcomes. You've rehearsed what you'll feel if the case goes one way or the other. And then reality lands in a form you can't rehearse. For Romy, the plea didn't feel like victory or vindication. It felt like confirmation of something she never wanted to be right about. Because when someone you love admits to the worst possible thing, you don't get closure. You get fracture. You lose the right to wonder what if. You lose the comfort of uncertainty. You lose the possibility that this might somehow make sense one day. And for the rest of the family, what was left of it, the plea drew invisible lines that could never be erased. This is the part of the story that doesn't make headlines. The part where the legal outcome collides with emotional reality. Because families don't process guilt the way courts do. Courts process facts. Families process meaning. And meaning is messy. Some family members likely replayed the past with brutal intensity. That argument at dinner. That tense silence in the hallway. That moment someone left early and no one asked why. Suddenly, nothing felt neutral anymore. Everything became evidence. And evidence doesn't just point outward. It points inward. Did I miss something? Did I ignore something? Did I normalize something that shouldn't have been normal? Those questions don't wait politely. They intrude. They repeat. They steal sleep. And here's the contradiction that makes this chapter so difficult. The plea ended the public guessing game, but it intensified the private one. Because when a story locks into place publicly, it forces those closest to it to confront versions of themselves they'd rather not see. Romy didn't just lose her parents. She lost her brother as a brother. From that moment on, he would exist in 2 forms. The person she grew up with, and the person the world now defined him as. Reconciling those 2 images is nearly impossible. People often ask why families retreat after something like this. Why they don't speak. Why they don't explain. Why they don't try to set the record straight. But how do you explain a loss this layered? How do you speak publicly when every word risks being interpreted as defense, blame, or betrayal? Silence becomes the only option that doesn't make things worse. And Nick's silence after the plea mattered just as much as his words. He didn't elaborate. He didn't justify. He didn't contextualize. That absence of explanation unsettled people. Because humans crave narrative. We want to know why. We want to understand motive. We want to believe there is a lesson we can extract that will keep this from happening again. But the plea refused to offer that. It closed the legal door without opening the emotional one, which left a vacuum. And vacuums are where speculation rushes back in. Was it anger? Resentment? Fear? Something else entirely? The public wanted answers. The family needed space. Those needs collided, and that collision created a new kind of pressure, one that had nothing to do with guilt or innocence. It had to do with interpretation. Every past interview Rob Reiner had ever given was re-examined. Every family photo was scrutinized. Every anecdote was reframed. People searched for clues that could explain how this happened. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most tragedies don't leave neat clues behind. They leave ambiguity. And ambiguity is intolerable to people looking for meaning. So meaning gets imposed. Some narratives focused on privilege. Others focused on family dysfunction. Others focused on mental health. Each explanation carried a piece of truth. None of them captured the whole. And inside that swirl, the family disappeared further from view, which is often interpreted as avoidance. But more often, it's survival. Because once the plea is entered, grief changes shape. Before, grief is chaotic. After, it becomes heavy. Final. You don't grieve the possibility of innocence anymore. You grieve the permanence of reality. And permanence forces decisions. What does life look like now? How do you move forward carrying this name, this history, this weight? For Romy, forward likely meant distance. Distance from cameras. Distance from commentary. Distance from narratives she couldn't control. And distance, in this context, isn't rejection. It's preservation. People underestimate how destructive public grief can be. Every expression becomes content. Every tear becomes a headline. Every silence becomes suspicious. There is no safe way to mourn in public. So the family withdrew. And as they did, the story entered its next phase. Sentencing. That word sounds clinical, administrative. But sentencing isn't just about punishment. It's about finalizing how a story will be remembered. Years, numbers, terms. Those details matter legally, but emotionally, they do something else. They turn an event into a lifetime. And that realization hits hardest when the courtroom empties and reality settles back in. Because no matter what sentence is imposed, it doesn't rewind time. It doesn't restore relationships. It doesn't answer every question. It simply draws a line and says, from here on, this is the truth you live with. And for Nick, that truth meant something deeply destabilizing. Not just incarceration, but erasure of the future he might have imagined. When people talk about remorse, they often imagine tears or apologies. But remorse can also look like collapse. Like the sudden understanding that there is no version of your life that escapes this moment. That every memory you have will now be filtered through it. And that realization doesn't come all at once. It comes in waves. After the plea, after sentencing discussions, after the first night when the door closes and doesn't reopen. And those waves don't just affect the person convicted. They affect everyone connected to them. Because families don't just lose people physically, they lose futures. The future where holidays look normal. The future where conversations don't carry this weight. The future where names don't trigger reactions. All of that disappears quietly, and the public rarely notices. They assume the story is over. But for the people inside it, the story has only changed chapters. Which brings us to something people avoid talking about. Responsibility. Not legal responsibility. Emotional responsibility. Who carries what now? Does Romy carry the burden of having spoken up? Does the family carry the burden of having stayed silent too long? Does Nick carry more than just the legal consequences? Those questions don't have satisfying answers. But they matter. Because how a family interprets responsibility determines whether tragedy becomes learning or just loss. And learning is the only thing that gives this story meaning beyond pain. But learning requires honesty. And honesty is hard when everything already hurts. As sentencing approached, the courtroom would once again fill with tension. But something had shifted. The shock had passed. The speculation had slowed. The reality had settled in. What remained was something heavier. Acceptance. Not acceptance in the sense of approval. Acceptance in the sense of acknowledgement. This happened. It can't be undone. And now we have to live with it. And that's where this chapter ends. Not with resolution, but with a pause. Because before the sentence is handed down, before numbers replace names, there is one more question that refuses to go away. If the signs were there, and the fear was present, and the family felt the tension building, why wasn't intervention strong?